And we're live on Facebook. Good evening, everybody. I'm Ben Pogue. In case you haven't joined us before, welcome to our Restorative Justice Forums. Just a little bit about myself. I'm an attorney in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, in case you're joining us from out of state. I'm also a candidate, the Democratic nominee for the Ninth Circuit Solicitor's role here in Charleston and in Berkeley County. And our Restorative Justice Forums are our own effort to make sure that we're engaging the community with discussions that maybe we haven't had quite so much of in recent years that we need to have more of, especially in our current political climate, in our current climate where we've got a lot of unrest and unresolved issues as communities, as states, and as a country. And part of the way we get to a better situation for all of us are having these discussions, honest discussions, at times emotional discussions, where we can start to get to the bottom of some of the questions that we have. And one of the things we're dealing with, really the topic for this week, is about decision-making in the context of what can be very grave decisions. We've got some great panelists for you this evening. We always have good panelists. We try and add some local voices, some more regional voices, and voices and perspectives from outside of our area too. There are other solutions besides what we experience locally, and the more perspectives we can gain, the better off we all are to share those perspectives and incorporate them into our own experience. So our topic this evening, why would someone do that? The context of grave decisions, that's what we're talking about. In Charleston and around the country, we see interactions between police and citizens, citizens and police, and sometimes they're hard to make sense of. One of the questions that we've seen here in Charleston, why would someone run from the police? That was the case in Walter Scott's life, at the end of his life, when he was shot by Michael Slager. And so that's one of the things at some point we need to start discussing. Why does somebody do that? Why does it make sense maybe in their context? Why does it not make sense? Why are those decisions hard to make? What about policing? What about our justice system and many decisions that people have to make, which don't always make sense to the rest of us who are on the outside looking in? We have some really fantastic guests from different perspectives. First, I want to introduce Sam Bellamy, who is the principal consultant for SC Mentors, a mentor training, technical assistance, and consulting company in Charleston aimed at strengthening the mentoring community in South Carolina. He coordinates mentoring resources statewide in South Carolina, working with the National Mentoring Resource Center and Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. Sam's a recipient of the 2015 Charleston Business Journal's Healthcare Hero Award and is a member of the Charleston Regional Business Journal's Class of 2016 40 Under 40. He's also the newest member of the North Charleston Planning Commission, author of a children's book called Hidden Gems, and I'm proud to say he's a member of our community action team. Sam holds a master's in public administration with a focus on nonprofit management. We'll hear from him in just a moment. Also with us this evening is Dr. Jen Baker. I'm going to take this off of my personal view and do the gallery view so you can start to see who's on Facebook, and you can pick Dr. Baker out of there. Dr. Baker is a professor of philosophy at the College of Charleston. She's an ethicist and a criminal justice reform advocate who currently serves on the board of a great organization, SC4CJR. CJR is Criminal Justice Reform. She also serves with My Community's Keeper and is a former academic community representative for the CJCC, the Charleston County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. She's the author of over 24 academic publications and the co-editor of Economics and Virtues for Oxford University Press. She's got a forthcoming book on ethics coming out on the market. And her teaching includes many courses, but one that's really interesting is ethics on policing. And she's done quite a bit of research in criminal justice and policing. And she's presented in Atlanta, Boulder, Colorado, Chicago, Las Vegas, Macon, New Orleans, all over the place. And one of the most cool things as a fan of the Daily Stoic podcast with Ryan Holiday, she's been a guest of Ryan Holiday's. One of my favorite podcasts, as the participants were discussing a little bit earlier, so check that out. And finally, our last guest, but certainly not least, is Dayle Carlson from Sacramento, California. Dayle began his career in 1971 as a deputy probation officer in Sonoma County, California, where he designed and implemented drug diversion programs for the entire county, eventually becoming a U.S. probation officer. After a decade in probation, he became a noted expert in sentencing and departure advocacy, consulting on thousands of cases, really from Maine to California, from Alaska to Florida, and everywhere in between. Dayle serves as an expert evaluator for fitness hearings, which are interesting. They're determinations of whether a juvenile should be charged as an adult or not. And he also serves in federal, state cases across the country, and he's got a master's in counseling psychology. So many different perspectives. So I'm going to start off with just sort of reiterating our topic, the context of grave decisions. This is all about tonight how and why we make some of the decisions that we do. And one of the reasons we've got so many folks in our Zoom participant room this evening is because we've all got these different perspectives. But Sam Bellamy, I'm going to start with you. And the big question we're starting out with is, and this is a question we hear all around the country posed in many different ways. Why does somebody commit an illegal act in the first place? And specifically with regard to your expertise, your work as a mentor and an organizer of mentors gives you unique insight, especially into the minds of juveniles who might be starting to move off into an area of behavior that could really get them into trouble. So that's the big question we're starting off with. Sam, can you share with us what your perspective and expertise tells us about why kids, juveniles specifically, sometimes go by the wayside and make not such great decisions?
Yeah, I think it's a great question with a not so great or maybe nuanced answer. If I was trying to be concise with it, I would just say because the reward of doing whatever the behavior is more important than the risk. I mean, that's the simplest way. When you look at a lot of whether it's crime or whether it's just regular pesky behavior, that's what youth are doing. They're weighing the risk and the reward of that activity. And for them, whether it's influenced by their peer pressure, whether it's influenced by the environment that they live in, some things are more important to them. And, as adults, we look at those situations and we say, oh, well, you shouldn't have done that because you know what's wrong. But in the community that they live in or the environment that they're brought up in, well, maybe the reward for doing that behavior is more important to them than whatever you deem acceptable.
Yeah, Sam,
that's
it's interesting. For instance, in North Charleston, we've got one of the highest high school homeless rates, which is inconceivable for a lot of folks. So what are some of the environmental conditions that juveniles are experiencing that it's hard to wrap your head around sometimes?
Well, I mean, you mentioned it. Homelessness, is one. You have youth that are navigating adult situations as teenagers. So whether it's how to put food on the table, how to earn money to help keep the lights on or keep food in the refrigerator. If you have teens that are, namely responsible for younger siblings, we're putting teens in adult situations, and we're asking them to respond in an adult manner when they're being put in situations that they shouldn't be put in the first place. And, you can look at that and say, well, it's the parents' fault or, whatever the case is, but there are so many other factors. I look at how we talk about education and how everything is connected. But for some odd reason, when we look at the problems of our society, we all of a sudden think that none of it's connected. So, we can't look at individual circumstances and say, oh, well, because you did this, it's your fault. We have to look at it collectively and say, well, there are a number of different factors that kind of played into where we are. And I think once we start doing that, we'll be able to actually address a lot of the issues that we're seeing productively. Because right now we're really just throwing throwing mud against the wall.
Yeah, it sounds, Sam, like sometimes we're just we're looking at the outcome, whatever that specific behavior is, and we're saying, okay, that's bad, but it's harder to get a bigger context. And speaking of a larger context, Dr. Baker, thank you for joining us this evening. Why don't you share your perspective on that larger context, how we view people who commit crime, maybe how that's stilted, and how somebody who does a behavior that is an offending behavior, illegal behavior, might it make sense to them in their personal philosophy?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, first of all, thank you for these forums. I learned so much from the previous one, so I'm a huge fan. I can't believe I get to participate. Also, I came to work because I thought the internet would be great. It already glitched out once, so if you lose me, move on. I'm sure you guys will be fine.
We're here for you.
I guess I can make three quick points in different categories. One kind of on human nature, one on our American system, and one in every single criminal justice system. And when it comes to our human nature, you know, we aren't always rational in the way we think of as common sense rational. It seems like the evidence shows in animals too that we're hyperbolic discounters. And so that means that—
Whoa, hyperbolic discounters.
Yeah, it's not catchy.
Okay, good.
I think I can explain it without us worrying too much about the term. But we like shorter, more secure rewards rather than longer term, larger rewards, ones that are going to be the result of a delay. We're all like that. We overcome it in all sorts of ways. I mean, one example off the top of my head would be high school students who know they'd be kicked off the volleyball team if they get caught drinking. Well, that is a way to make very vivid a long-term consequence. I mean, longer term than that evening. And that's the way that we resist short-term temptations. But the suggestion for behavioral scientists is that we're really designed to pay far more attention to short-term rewards. So that would be all of us. And some of us have come up with good tactics to avoid those temptations. But then our criminal justice system here in the US, I think, is unhelpful when it comes to people exhibiting a lot of rational decision-making when it comes to crimes of most sorts. I'm not sure I can incorporate, you know, really violent crimes. I might have to put in a different category.
Yeah, there are many different categories, and maybe that's part of what we need to always having in the back of our mind is that there are not only different contexts, but there are so many different behaviors, and we've got to learn to maybe understand, first of all, that there is a spectrum of different contexts for us to understand not just why the behavior happens, but maybe what punishment or what rehabilitation is correct too.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
Yes, that's so helpful because it's hard to think of them all at once. But if it's something like robbery, we have, I mean, I think my data is a little old. It's the FBI data from, I think it's 2008, but it was something like 500,000 robberies in the US that were reported. So that's just reported. And then there were only the next year, about 40,000 convictions. So that goes, yeah, that goes into this decision-making too. We have a very uncertain punishment system. So you could play the odds, and the odds aren't terrible in that regard. Now the consequences are we have, you know, historic worldwide extreme punishment for crime. So the consequence, if you do get arrested, is large, but I would suggest too large to really appreciate. In my experience, talking to people who have been imprisoned, they've really admitted they had no idea what was coming. It's just too difficult to conceive of, you know, a month in jail, I think, let alone years in prison. So that would reduce the rationality of any decision making if our punishment is so extreme. And then I don't want to go on for too long. So
yeah, no, that's really, it's really interesting. And actually we've got a couple of links to share with our audience. One of them is Dan Ariely's book, Payoff: The Hidden Logic That Shapes Our Motivations. It's it's an interesting, fairly basic. If I can catch up with it, then it's got to be somewhat basic.
Yeah,
right?
he's great.
Yeah, but really interesting work on why people do the things that they do. We're dropping in a couple of links on specifically research related to juveniles cost benefit analysis in crime, what kids are thinking, what makes sense to them. But it's interesting that you bring up the number of cases that were, number of crimes that were reported, because one of the things we see is in areas where there are a whole lot of African-American concentration. We know that we have that a lot of times because of historic factors, because of historic racial bias, segregation. We see really low reporting as far as crimes are concerned. And one of the things that we have learned from the CJCC, that the trust level in a lot of places is not that high. So they sort of seem like they go together. And I wonder if that affects the decision-making process also, which is why I want to bring Dayle Carlson into the conversation. Dayle, one of the things that you do as part of your job is to really get to know people who have come into the criminal justice system and why they do things, sometimes even if their decision-making process in their own context is skewed. So what can you share with us about how different somebody's perspective might be from what we think of as the norm?
Well, one of the things I think we need to start with is separate adult from juvenile justice systems and the way they operate. The Supreme Court in the last 10, 15 years has decided cases that have basically said the justice system has to consider the biological limitations of a juvenile, and that there are aspects of brain development that have an impact on decision making that kids engage in. Prefrontal cortex has clearly been demonstrated to be the brakes on impulse control, long-term planning, being able to appreciate the consequences of your conduct. That's why the cost benefit thing certainly fits into there. But when you start dealing with juveniles, that's a much shakier, I think, foundation in terms of trying to understand where the conduct comes from.
So we've got, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but it sounds like, Dayle, you're saying we've got undeveloped brains that are making these decisions. And then
Correct.
It seems like if we're incorporating some of what Sam was talking about, we've got people who are maybe not in great environmental situations. And then as one expert I talked to recently mentioned, a lot of times if there's added stress, we just as humans don't make good decisions to begin with when we're under stress. So it seems like all that is coming to bear in some of these, what can be fateful decisions.
I think you're right. And I think one of the other separations that needs to be made are those crimes, if you will, or offenders that engage repeatedly in illegal conduct for whatever benefit they derive. And a kid in a crisis, a kid that makes a momentary decision, that kid can actually do something much more heinous than the former, than the well thought out, committed criminal, the person that wants to continue in a criminal career. California has done some interesting things in the last 5 or 6 years in terms of changing the way the system responds to juveniles. In many states, including California, kids that were involved in homicides were getting life without possibility of parole for offenses they committed when they were 16 years old. That was happening in quite a number of jurisdictions. Well, the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You got to recognize that these are kids and their brains are malleable, they're forming. The evidence shows that it takes through their early 20s for these kids to be able to develop the skills to be able to handle the stresses that you're talking about. Then when you talk about the underlying conduct, I think the motivation for engaging in criminal activity is every bit as idiosyncratic as the person making the decision. That there are cultural influences, there's economic influences, there's religious influences, there's all sorts of influences that contribute to a kid and an adult making a decision to engage in risky behavior that could have really dire consequences.
And it sounds, Dayle, like we don't always know really we don't always have a good understanding on the front end of what those factors are. So when we have somebody who starts along that path, not such a great path, offending behavior, illegal behavior. When that starts to snowball, when there are all these other factors that come on in, how difficult is it to put somebody back on the right track? And what does it practically look like? I mean, you've dealt with thousands upon thousands of individuals who have done very serious criminal acts. What is a practical timeline of things that you see as the train really goes off the rails?
Well, that's a big question, Ben.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge question, and I appreciate the fact that you're focusing on it, because I don't think anybody's come up with the appropriate answer for that question yet. Nevertheless, the system is ideally designed, and I know that it changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that once someone's apprehended, charged with a crime and convicted, the probation office for that particular jurisdiction looks into the very issues you're talking about. What's the underlying cause of this offense conduct? What factors, environmental factors, have contributed to Johnny committing this particular crime? What is the risk reward element when you're dealing with more mature brains? That's what ideally the probation officer is supposed to be mining and excavating and getting information to serve the court, to give the judge the best possible information available in terms of what are we supposed to do here? Do we send Johnny to a drug treatment program when the real reason he's using drugs is because he's trying to mask a depression, a major depression? So we should be dealing with that rather than the drug issues. I mean, these are very, very complicated issues. And as I say, I think they're very idiosyncratic to the person.
Yeah, and so Jen, let me bring it back to you real quick. One of the things that's, it sounds like we're hearing as a common thread is so many different factors. And then we've got the factor of society and even people who are part of the justice system looking at an individual and facing real practical constraints about having to make a decision very quickly where there's lots to do and sometimes not enough funding or manpower. How do we start understanding our own philosophical context that we've got so that we can make better decisions about an individual at this point where we're seeing the end result of offending behavior, but try and at the same time consider all the factors that go into that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's very philosophical and ethical, and I think sometimes we forget to remember how regular crime has always been. Every society, in ancient times, they expected that there'd be crime no matter how well they educated the citizens with this kind of ideal in mind. And if we thought of it that way and kind of anticipated and weren't so surprised by it, sometimes it seems like we're surprised case by case, then I think we would realize how important the carrots are. So of course, money's tempting, of course, shortcuts are tempting. They're tempting to all of us. But if you have the resources and the help and the long-term interests and goals and big projects that you're interested in, that will keep you from being tempted. And I know people don't like to think of making conditions better for someone who committed a crime, but I think big picture, if you want to reduce crime, there's no other way to think of it.
Yeah, that's true. That's one of the things we're trying to do. Sam, Bellamy, you deal with a lot of kids. How many kids, teenagers, really have an understanding of what the ramifications of their actions are? Maybe if they do, then they're different than I was, maybe when I was a kid.
Yeah, I can't imagine that a lot of them do. And it's, just to speak on the point that Dr. Baker just made, in terms of, thinking about crime as a regular thing, but also thinking about all the factors that lead into that. If we just take into one situation and one consideration just to put on the table, especially for us working on this community action team with you, Ben, when we talk about, a young person, let's say, selling drugs, whatever, trying to increase their finances, whatever the case is. It may be because the family life, the finances, maybe one working parent who's not, doesn't have livable wages, whatever the case is. When we talk about criminal justice and trying to address some of these things, what we really should be looking at is okay, this person committed this crime. We can look into this background and say it was a financial reason versus them wanting to be career criminals. And the first thing that we should consider is, well, let's look at the household's financial security. If the household isn't financially secure, then maybe we need to, kind of address that. That might also extend to, family-friendly work policies. If you have a parent that is working these god-awful hours because they're not making a livable wage, it's taking them out of the household. Now that person doesn't, that young person is now assuming on adult responsibilities. So when we say, it's not just that one instance, we're looking at a totality of a picture here. That's what we should look at. It's like a string of activities that kind of lead upon one another. There's a term, I guess they call it ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
Right.
That's really what it's referring to. If we can prevent some of these adverse experiences, we can reduce a lot of these crimes. I mean, a lot of this stuff is probably preventable if we looked at a holistic approach in how we address it versus just honing in on the crime itself. Well, let's address the crime. We're not saying absolve them of their responsibility for whatever part they took. But what we're saying is now that we've addressed their responsible response to what they're seeing, what else is next? It's talking about prevention, and that's really where we get into a lot of the disagreements about how we address certain things. Some people are looking specifically at the action and the reaction versus trying to look at prevention. And that's kind of where we need to be looking at is prevention versus just the reaction after it's happened.
Yeah, so maybe part of prevention, what we're trying to do is have some understanding of how we can relate maybe our own experiences to the experiences that other people are having. Even if it's just saying, wow, my experience is limited, I probably need more perspective. And that's part of the reason we have breakout sessions, which I'm going to put everybody in right now. So go ahead and look on your screen and you'll have a breakout session. And here's the question for your breakout session. What reined in someone who you know or you from a potential string of bad decisions, and what resources did you have? Discuss in our breakout rooms. And while our participants are looking on their screen and clicking on join the breakout room, there's one person who's not going to be in a breakout room because he's going to talk with me to our Facebook Live audience. And that is my friend Don DJ Polite. And DJ, one of the reasons I wanted you here to talk about this is because we're talking about contexts, right? And you've got a master's degree in history, and your doctoral research is really in race and justice. And a lot of that, I think empire, there's something with empire that's part of your research.
Yes.
But a lot of it deals with the disparities that we have, which can really be colossal. So when I think of times when I went off the rails, I had loads of different resources to act as guardrails to put me back in. And so did my parents. And so did my parents' parents. And so did all the friends of ours in our neighborhood. And so did our school system, my teachers, my mentors, all had ways that they could say, hey, Ben, put yourself back on this path. But not everybody has it. And it's really hard sometimes for somebody who maybe looks like me, grew up in a white privileged environment like I did, to understand a lack of resources that somebody else might have, given huge separations in our society.
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely true. I'm going to go a little personal and then go back historical. It's one of those things I think about. If you don't understand who a person is, like their condition, you look at them with skepticism, right? So I think about me. I've had many different run-ins with law enforcement for one reason, shape, or form in different communities. I moved around a lot of military brat. And there were certain circumstances where I would be like the one person of color around. That comes with skepticism of what am I doing there, but I'm also at times someone who also exists on the autism spectrum, not far, but my actions sometimes don't fit what people understand as the norm. And because of who I am as a person of color, now my actions are looked at with another level of scrutiny. And so, I mean, a brief personal thing just goes more into a sort of context where, as a historian, that is one of those things where people talk about, well, you know, the history of law enforcement is about slave patrols. And that is partially true. But largely, when we think about law enforcement and whose actions are most put under a microscope, it really is sometimes regionally culturally specific. You know, we've had this conversation before where, you know, at some points in time, like policing was really a question of, oh, there's not African Americans moving up from the U.S. South to the urban north.
Hey, DJ, can you say that one more time? I think your microphone may be going in and out just a little bit. So
Okay.
Talk a little bit more about the policing disparities and how history's played into that.
Right. So long story short, policing is almost always about who are the groups of people that we distrust the most. Who are the individuals who are particularly new to an area, or do have less access in areas, so they're less likely to have material property, and so they're not the ones of power or property and privilege, and so they're the ones who are seen as most likely to try to take. And so now their actions are put under more of a microscope. You know, historically, that might mean, like in the West, that might have been migrants from Asia, China. These are individuals who are coming from a different country. They have different cultural norms. And now Americans who are living out West are saying, you know what, maybe because we don't know what they are here for, maybe we don't know like what their ultimate aims are, we need to like, police this a little bit more until their actions look like our actions.
It feels almost like this is somewhat reminiscent maybe of what Dr. Baker was talking about, the disparities in our own context and the lack of familiarity or our perceived similarity with somebody from a different environment, and then maybe combined with some element of racial bias, which we know is there, and then combined with notions of authority and who should be acting like whom. And you mentioned distrust specifically. You know, and it's interesting, and I've got good friends who are police officers, and my good friends who are police officers, they really work on their own bias. They have a thought process that says, wait a second, when they approach a scene, they're thinking, wait a second, am I thinking the right way? They really do a lot of internal work and introspection to say, how do I make sure I'm being fair, that I'm not, you know, falling back on an environment or context that shouldn't apply here, to make sure I'm really handling this right. But not everybody does that. It sounds like the more distance that we have between people, then the more the people who are authority figures, in these cases police, are apt to push on to other individuals what their context or pre-existing context is. Does that make sense? Am I on the right track there?
Right. And, you know, this is not anything to do with police. You know, it is the question of, yes, police, also society. Who are the people that we believe are more likely to act deviantly?
Who's more likely to offend, right? That's the question.
Right.
Right, but
so
the statistics sort of show us that crime rates are pretty even across socioeconomic differences, across racial, cultural, gender differences. So how do we incorporate that knowledge, which is data, into our perspective on the world?
And I mean, it's questions like checking our own perceptions, right? Because we can see, like, oh, well, data shows us that, you know, these crimes is across racial class lines, but our conception tells us, well, if somebody has money or has class, wherever it could be, maybe what they're doing, you know, that might have been a question of a bad lapse of judgment. They will get past it. But what we really need to do is look back at this community over here where they don't have the resources, they don't have this, they don't have that, and they're constantly struggling to really get more. Their actions might have more meaning behind them. So our perceptions tell us that there's a population who's actually, even if they show us that they're doing the same crime, that somehow we tell ourselves they are more likely to do it once and we can forgive them. Needs more guardrails.
I lost your audio just a little bit there, so I'm going to ask you to reiterate that point. But when you talk about resources, it's interesting. Our criminal justice system often depletes people of resources, which if somebody's got resource scarcity or a lack of resources to begin with, puts them on an even worse path. And if you're a person who doesn't have many resources, and some of the resources you're lacking are other people in your family or close circle who have resources, then you're depleting everybody's resources. It's sort of like a force multiplier of resource deprivation, which seems like it makes somebody who gets into the system more likely to really go and make a left-hand turn there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what we talked about is we have a long history of defining of thinking that public services should be moral means tested. That certain people deserve public services, and by their actions, you can take those public services away, and then blame their actions on that hand. So I think about my empire. I looked a lot about Puerto Rico. They had a similar kind of trajectory where, we're going to take public services away because people are likely to abuse public services, which again limits resources, and then crime is appearing. So what we need to do is increase police presence, which only does the thing of catching people who are struggling more, and you're not fixing the situation. All you're doing is tightening the crucible and then getting surprised that when you tighten the crucible more, people are actually angry, and all you're doing is seeing that anger or seeing those behaviors that you kind of force people into.
Yeah,
that happens.
Yeah, and anger is something that we see consistently. Folks are coming out of the breakout rooms, and I'm eager to get back to the rest of the discussion. But anger is something that we see in terms of unrest. It sounds like, we look at the landscape right now, and people are definitely angry. We see protests, we see unrest all over the place. So part of what we want to do is to forge a path forward where there's less anger. And I wonder if one of the ways to do that is to have more discussion like we're having right now. DJ Polite, thank you for your input. We've got everybody back. So I want to bring back our panelists, because we were asking really personal questions in the first breakout session. We're not going to ask our panelists to divulge a whole lot of that information, because we want to make sure that we have safe spaces for people to share their perspective where they can remain safe and confidential. But if each of our panelists can give us a quick kind of conclusory sentence that doesn't divulge too much from the breakout rooms, that'd be great. Sam, can you go ahead and take it away and start with your room and what you got from it? A quick takeaway.
Yeah, I think a quick takeaway for what our group talked about is really that there are no support systems to support individuals that are dealing with whether it is mental health issues or substance abuse issues. And because of it, it kind of perpetuates some of the crime that you see. There's nowhere that they can get adequate help and resources.
Okay, Dayle, I'm putting you on the spot next. What did you get out of your room?
Well, what we got out of it principally was that this is such a complicated subject that it's very difficult to solve all the problems and make the rest of us geniuses with regard to this. But the other thing that I think came out was that risk-reward analysis, that sort of rational discussion as to why Johnny does A or Johnny does B, often doesn't prevail. and it's other, quote, bad choices that come out of whatever it is an individual gets attracted to that contributes to engaging in crime. And by the way, my guys were great.
You got, throwing down the challenge for the best breakout session. Jen Baker, what was the brief thing that you got out of your room?
Well, I had the best breakout session, and
Oh,
I learned a lot in a few minutes. One thing we went over was how we had behaved badly when we were young, but we didn't all get arrested for that behavior, and how different things would be if we had, and that we also aged out of it without any intervention. So that was one thing we talked about. That, but then we also had the really helpful suggestion that community service is something that young offenders are very responsive to, and for this psychological reason, it's embarrassing to be seen doing community service. So it was an answer that like responded to the description we had of how immature we are as teenagers or young people. I mean, that would be a vivid consequence if longer term consequences wouldn't be.
yeah, boy, that's really interesting. So with that context, and DJ Polite and I were talking more about a historical context. So let's go on to a really difficult question. And Dayle, I want to start with you because you've interacted with a whole lot of people who've been in this situation. Why does somebody run from the police? This is a particular interest in Charleston, where Walter Scott was somebody who was stopped for a taillight out. There's a lot of folks who are, if they were in that situation, might start off with the assumption that, oh my gosh, maybe I'm being stopped for a racially biased reason. And then we've talked about a level of trust or mistrust maybe that somebody has in the justice system. And then depending on how an interaction goes, and really, like you said, idiosyncratic dynamics of any interaction, do we start to see why somebody might make that decision, especially one that's being made under duress in a really stressful situation that nobody can train for?
Well, Ben, I think there are two levels to the answer to your question. There's the momentary stress and the sort of the panic that adrenaline can create in a person. But then there's a knowledge of an historical perspective that folks, and you know, frankly, it's our African American brothers and sisters that are really paying the price for this sort of systemic racism that unbelievably it seems like it's escalating. The more information that we apply, the more interest that we have, the more focus that we have on it seems to have not the desired effect. And so I think in those situations, there's almost a rational part of it, is that I'm being stopped by this guy. This guy's got a reputation. He's carrying a gun. I got to get out of here. That I think is something that exists systemically. And then there are the individual reasons. People who have been harshly punished for fairly non-serious conduct. Translate that into, I'm going to be punished for this silly conduct of having a taillight out. That gets translated pretty quickly.
They have a major impact.
Exactly.
Depending on how the justice system views that. And, you know, it's interesting.
So I think those two things are competing with one another.
Yeah, so we've got these competing interests. And Dr. Baker, one of the things you mentioned is sometimes the inability to really see into the future about the future ramifications, whereas the immediate response to a threat, maybe what we might call system one thinking versus system two thinking, for anybody who's read Kahneman and Tversky at Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. How does that play into it as well?
Well, I'm going to put some blame on our system because it's not as if I can envision someone calculating rationally the consequence that now they're 5 years, they're going to spend 5 years in prison because they've been caught for something and they violated probation. I mean, I think sometimes we take this outsider's perspective where we want complete obedience from people. I began writing on these issues when a college student at University of Texas, Austin was jogging, couldn't hear the police officers tell her to stop, and got tackled and thrown into a car. And her reaction was the panicked reaction you'd have if you were being kidnapped and thrown into a car. You could tell she had no idea what was going on. And a lot of the public was furious at her for not being more submissive. I feel like that's a factor. I mean, we want this kind of non-human compliance in these situations that are terrifying. I mean, just subjectively terrifying.
Yeah, we do hear that from law enforcement officers. Why won't somebody just, or if they had just complied? But regular citizens aren't taught to comply, although a lot of African Americans who I talk to who are adults who have kids, and some of our panelists and our participants and I have had this discussion. When your African American child is 12, 13, 14 years old, you have the talk about how to respond to some of these things. But still, it doesn't really prepare anybody. Sam Bellamy, when a juvenile is put into that position, when they're confronted with police and they know that they've done something wrong, how probable is it that they will react just the right way, or how probable is it that they're not going to really know what to do and not make a good decision?
It really depends on how many times they've been in that situation. I think somebody who has never necessarily been stopped by the police, they might kind of have a deer in the headlights approach to it. Somebody may have a little bit more experience in that. They may, be more likely to react differently. I think, again, as Dr. Baker mentioned, it's really, I look at the situation and it's sad that I do look at it this way, but I look at stopping for the police in the same manner in which I would stop for a mugger or a violent criminal encounter. I'm thinking to myself, well, do I fight or can I realistically get away? The reality is a lot of instances where police are stopping people and they're taking that risk to run out of self-preservation. It's really for nonviolent crimes. So when you look at that and you consider, okay, I'm being detained, I'm being stopped, my freedoms are being taken away. I don't know if I'm going to survive this. What are the chances of me getting away and then maybe getting my affairs in order and turning myself in? Like, is it better to do something like that or risk, having a scuffle with the police on the side of the road? There are a lot of different situations that come to mind for me as an African-American man. And my number one priority is to make it home. So if I feel like I can make it home by running away as opposed to exchanging on the side of the road, that's what I'm going to do. And I have good sense, but I'm going to weigh that and I'm going to take that into consideration. So I think a lot of it, experience, attitude of the officer. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that come in the situation that come into play. And if I'm a young person who's scared, I might take that risk.
Yeah, we've got a strange situation. And one of the things I really wish we did better in our criminal justice system was gather data so that we could understand what some of these contexts and mindsets are. We don't really gather the socioeconomic data that we need. For juveniles, we don't gather enough information about their families or their family resource network. So a lot of times when we are using a system that chiefly, overwhelmingly uses prison, parole, probation, the 3 Ps, it doesn't really give us an opportunity to make sure that we do what the medical field does, which is diagnose and then have a tailored response to that individual to get them on the right path. Sam, it's interesting that you mentioned the context of being mugged. I was literally in that position. And my context as a person of white privilege who has a psychology degree as my first degree, who has a mom who was in the educational system and then became a counselor. When I was going through that, I thought, well, I'm going to try and work with this person. I'm going to use some of the ways I was trained as a resident assistant in college and some of my psychological training to get this person on board, even though they're holding a gun to my head, to help them be in a cooperative mood. That was my default. But without that context of a degree and training for 3 years as a resident assistant at William & Mary, having a mom who went into counseling, there's no way that I react properly in that situation. So let's flip that script and let's instead talk about something that's strange and might be uncomfortable, but how and why do police react the way that they do in that situation? And I think we've got a link to a really interesting article called Principal Policing. If you're not familiar with Professor Seth Stoughton at University of South Carolina, he's done some really interesting work on this, as well as sort of behavioral analysis. But we do have police officers who are trained that they are in an environment where their lives may be at risk. And as DJ Polite was talking about, we've got a real disparity in terms of context. How do we start wrapping our mind around what the real life context is of a police officer and how we start changing that context? Dayle, you work with federal and state authorities. I'll let you start off on this really uncomfortable question.
It is an uncomfortable question, and I think that there's a big distinction that we should start out with. And there's a difference between violating the law and violating the officer. And when you go from violating the law to violating the officer, that's when things turn bad. And you would like officers to have the sort of insight and response control, impulse control, that they don't convert violating the law into violating the officer. A very close friend of mine for the state of California evaluates police candidates. He's a psychologist and he evaluates them. And it is really true. The system designs police officers to be warriors. And when you have that kind of mentality, it begs the question. And what it does is it melds the violating the law and violating the officer. And I think that's when things really get bad and prejudice comes into play. Power struggles, and I don't necessarily mean fighting, but power struggles take place. And the outcomes that we're sadly seeing all over the country occur.
And Jen, you know, when we're talking about perspectives and broad context that people have, you know, I'm going to go to you next on this. How do we start wrapping our minds around this so that we can start generating solutions rather than simply saying, okay, we've got a problem here?
Well, once again, I'm going to blame the public for some of their views, for our views, because I've heard from officers enough that I'm convinced they feel responsible for the totality of a situation. So it might be something incredibly minor, but if they don't feel they take care of the situation or act, I sometimes describe it as if it's an emergency, you know, and it's a broken taillight. Is it really an emergency? But they will say, imagine what I would hear if I had let him go. So that's us. I mean, expecting a person or two people to take total control of a complex situation as if it's an emergency. But I worry it's a bit of egging on or shaming from the public about this warrior role that we expect police to have. And it's just an unrealistic description of anyone's abilities.
So a cop going into a situation, so one of the things that you've heard, and you teach policing ethics, is that the cop is also at the same time gauging what negative reinforcement they may get from society then if they don't address this in an aggressive manner.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there are a lot of articles about this on Police One, for example, that police share and stories police share with each other. But that's part of the terrible burden, I think, of that job, is that our expectations are completely unrealistic. They're to take on all the risk, and they're supposed to get total control of situations. And it makes everything an emergency when we could, you know, get a warrant and with a carrot slowly get someone back to court, you know, something like that, rather than have to stop them because they had a taillight out.
Sam, Bellamy, one of the things that I hear from officers when my friends and I are discussing some of these situations is, what am I supposed to do? What was I supposed to do in that situation? You know, it's remarkably similar to sometimes what we hear from parents who have a child in a situation they feel like is unlawful. What do? I don't know what to do. how do we start seeing some of the similarities where we have a crisis of decision-making when we don't know what to do, so we can start generating solutions and understanding the context of our bad decisions.
I think one thing that could help with that is, again, looking at it from the prevention aspect. You know, a lot of times when we get young people being referred to mentors from families or even the court system, things of that nature, it's normally when the situation has already gotten out of control. So we have to look at, again, not from a reactionary standpoint, but from a prevention standpoint, and just saying, well, I know positive role models are helpful. I know community, community support systems are important. The same holds true for policing. I'm a big fan of community policing. If you're an individual who doesn't live in that particular neighborhood, again, I would look at prevention, and either you need to move there so that you can live amongst the residents, or you need to get familiar with the residents in that zip code or that area before you begin actively policing that area, so that when you come across these individuals and situations occur, you'll have more information. I feel like we make the best decisions when we have the most information, and sometimes when we have police officers coming in contact with individuals that they're unfamiliar with and situations that they're unfamiliar with the pressure that Dr. Baker talked about, it's really a pressure cooker. And it breeds that you versus me type, situation. And I think all of that can be avoided if, we look at it from a prevention standpoint. The other part is, I think it was Dayle who mentioned it, was that, was this violation against the person. I think a lot of situations get out of hand because officers think that, anybody that they stop or anybody that they talk to is supposed to give them blind, devotion and just, answer all of my questions, do exactly what I tell you to do. And that's not necessarily the role of an officer. So I think when you get into those situations, you're going to have that power struggle. So I think if you're an individual who is, being sent to respond to a situation, I think you owe it to yourself to first gather information. But more importantly, the goal should be, getting to a resolution that doesn't involve any type of violence or loss of life or any of that. I think that should be your goal. And I can't say 100% that that's always the case in a lot of these situations.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the perspective, how we're all different, but also the offending against the individual. We are all human beings, and it's hard, no matter who you are, not to get offended sometimes. But it seems like that is something that is predictable, and that, as you mentioned, really attacking the problem from the prevention end, that's probably something that we need to think about. We are going to go a little bit long today. It's okay if some of our participants need to leave early, I understand. But we do want to make sure we get one more breakout session in here. So as I assign everybody to breakout rooms one more time, I think we've got everybody in the same rooms. I'm going to open the rooms. So here's the second breakout question. It's, how do we work to change these contexts? That's a really difficult question, but how do we work to change these contexts and to promote understanding of our different contexts? All right, the rooms are open. Go ahead and click on it, and we'll be back. We'll take everybody out of the rooms in about 6 or 7 minutes, so you won't have a ton of time. But during that time, I want to talk to our next special guest, who's going to be one of our panelists in 2 weeks, when we are talking about healing the harm of domestic violence. And my guest is Mackie Krawcheck-Moore, who's the head of Thrive SC. And let me make sure, I got to make sure that Don Polite is in a breakout room. There we go. Yeah, everybody's gotten their invitations. There we go. So Mackie, we're talking about different contexts that maybe people don't understand. And one of the most foreign contexts, and we've seen this discussed on a local, but also a national scale, is the context of someone who is a victim of domestic or intimate partner violence. And it's also one of the biggest hurdles in terms of victims reporting in the first place, that belief that nobody's going to understand me. So we're going to dive into this a lot more in 2 weeks on September 23rd. But can you give us a snapshot of the landscape, what our domestic violence landscape is right now for victims and what the solutions are, and maybe a little bit of where we need to go?
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Ben. And South Carolina is, again, at the top or bottom of the list, however you want to look at it. We are often first in the nation for the number of women murdered by men per year at a rate of more than double the national average. So we have a big problem in South Carolina with this issue. And there are a lot of reasons, and we can talk about that in 2 weeks because it's a very complex issue. There are a couple things that are important to know. One is that domestic violence cuts through every social strata. You may think that it's only happening in underserved neighborhoods, on the street, with folks that are minorities, but that's a huge misconception. So much domestic violence is also among the more elite, the wealthier classes, the white as well as Black, as well as Hispanic, brown people, Black people. It's everywhere, and it's a great way to look at it is it's a silent epidemic because people don't know how much it's really going on and all around you. Women, and women, I focus on women and children because that is about 90% of who are victims of domestic violence. So I do focus more on women. And it's a really, really tough situation. And it's hard for anyone, but it's very interesting to think about having a woman who may seem like she has it all and lives in the big house, and her husband's the doctor or a lawyer, and she has a lot of friends and is in this great social situation, but behind closed doors, what nobody knows is she's being abused. And you can't tell a lot of times. It's sometimes the person that you last suspect, because a lot of times abusers don't fit the profile of what you might see on television, for example.
Is there a profile? I'm not sure.
No, but
really
I'll tell you.
We certainly have a misconception that there is a profile. I'll be able to figure it out. And parents do this too. I have a friend who is a victim of domestic violence and abuse for years. Parents had no idea. And parents thought, well, of course I'm going to know it if it happens to my daughter.
Yeah.
But no.
It's amazing. There's so much shame and humiliation around the victim because they are, first of all, brainwashed into believing that they're asking for it. You have done this, and that's why you're being hit. I wouldn't hit you. I wouldn't say terrible things to you. I wouldn't choke you if you didn't do X, Y, and Z, but you do. So you're forcing me to behave the way I do or to react the way I do. And so a woman often internalizes that and thinks it's her fault that she's being beaten. And if she wasn't a terrible person or a bad person or whatever she's being told by her significant other, it's like a shame spiral that women go into. And the more they're abused, the deeper into the spiral they go, and the harder it is to pull yourself out. So there's a lot of
being really a lifelong thing that you need continual sort of therapy from or conditioning from. And kids go through this too. You know, in the psychological community, people talk about magical thinking of children.
Right.
Especially when they're in an abusive situation. Oh, maybe if I do this, then my parents will be okay. Maybe if I do this, then dad won't hit mom, which can really be, Sam Bellamy talked earlier about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
Yes.
Abuse, parental abuse, even if it's not of the child, just the child witnessing it. It's a big thing, and it can be a colossal influence for a lifetime.
Huge. And much more often, a boy will grow up to be an abuser if he's watched it in his home. And a young girl will grow up and think that's normal because that's what she's seen her whole life. And it's interesting because even though, for example, a little boy watches his father and he wants to protect his mother, and there's nothing he can do, and he's frustrated, and he's just this little person, and he will never do this to his wife. And then he grows up, and it's almost like it's cellular. It gets into the body and brain, and they act it out, even though they've sworn that they would never do that to their significant other. It's amazing how deeply psychological these kids are affected.
Oh, yeah, it's huge. There are just so many different levels, and like we were talking about earlier, when when we're trying to understand the decision-making process of kids, really difficult to understand how they're going to be affected long-term, and the different things that they've got to parse out psychologically what those motivations and intentions are. Is there a way out of this? There is a way out of it?
There is absolutely a way out of it. It's not easy, but there is help. Thrive, which is the organization that I founded and run, is more for transitional housing after the emergency is over. So when somebody first is in an emergency situation and they call the police, and it's very important that they do that, because a police record or filing with the police is really important when you want to go to court and maybe get a restraining order, or you want to go, for example, to an emergency shelter like my sister's house. If they see, sorry about that. If they see a police report, then it just validates the situation more. And there's not a lot of room. And in Charleston, especially in the Tri-County area, we have about 36 emergency beds for over 700,000 residents. So,
Can you say that one more time?
Yes.
I think folks who might be watching live on Facebook might think you got the numbers wrong.
No, and I don't have the wrong. And it's 36 beds for over 700,000 residents in the Tri-County area. And I used to work at my sister's house, and I saw how many people were being turned away every day. And I thought there has got to be more that we can do about this. And after several years, I left and founded another organization so that we could create more room and more housing, more programs and services and employment opportunities and employment training. And I'm a big believer in holistic healing too, with meditation and yoga and mindfulness.
Situation.
Yes.
All these different resources.
Yes.
Hey,
so,
Mac.
hey there, how are you?
Well, thanks.
Good. Nice to see you.
Well, Mackie, we're going to get into it a whole lot more. And, it's interesting. Maybe that's our stepping off point to have folks who are more interested in that topic join us in a couple of weeks, is that when it comes to domestic and intimate partner violence, that there are people like you who want to do the right thing, who want to provide those resources, but we don't have them. And it's interesting, your dog bark, as if to say, hey, there are more shelters for me if I'm abused than there are for women who are abused.
That's right. Let me tell you one last statistic that we can end on. There are 46 counties, I believe, in South Carolina. All 46 have animal shelters. 14 have domestic violence shelters.
Yeah,
The
Preach it,
animals are
Mackie.
more.
Preach it, Mackie.
I'm preaching it. I mean, it's time for us to really take this bull by the horn. There you go. Ben's got the Thrive mask on. Feel free to buy masks from us because it goes straight to the programs and services. But it's incredible. And also, perhaps the dog barked because she wanted you to know that that we also house pets of domestic violence survivors. So when the family leaves, now the pets have a place to go too, because a lot of times a mother and child won't leave their furry family member behind because they're the first to get abused.
Wow. Well, we'll get much more into it on the domestic violence front with our discussion on September 23rd, Healing the Harm of Domestic Violence. Okay, so Dayle and Jen and Sam, I'm going to put you on the spot one more time. Share what's happening in the room. Sam, why don't you're unmuted, why don't you go first?
Well, taking cues from my other breakout panelists, we had the best breakout group.
I knew you were going to say that.
Just wanted to throw that out there. You know, our conversation was really a continuation of our first breakout. And what we realized is that none of this that we talk about really changes until people really look at the system totally. We realize that there's a lot of, you know, it's a health access issue. It is a systems issue. And I think until we address it as a whole, rather than individual segments of it, I think we can't change the context. So I think we have to change how we're looking at things so that we can switch the conversation versus trying to pinpoint different parts of, you know, different parts of the system. It's really a conjoined effort, and we have to look at it from an overview standpoint.
All right, the holistic systems view. I love it. Dr. Jen Baker, what did you get out of still vying for the title of Best Breakout Room? What did you get out of it?
Well, I don't know if we can beat that last one, but we thought about PTSD in officers and whether you can admit it and get treatment for it, and how it might arise from things that the public doesn't worry about that often, like responding to a car accident, that kind of trauma. And then we also got to the point where we suggested that officers be listened to more about social problems or laws that they think are stupid that they have to enforce. And then it was pointed out to me that that's on your platform. So I feel like a bad student, but I'm very excited.
No, it's okay. We definitely want to see our deputy solicitors, all of them actually going on ride-alongs once a year with a police officer to hear about what their perspective is so that we can trade context, sort of like context trading.
Wow.
Okay, well, okay, so we'll do that. The doctor says it's a good idea. All right, Dayle Carlson, what do you got in your awesome breakout room?
By the way, we stopped competing as to which is the best breakout. Okay. We pretty much segued into from what we were talking about before. And one of the phenomenon that we discussed is how you can create the other in your life. And if you can create the other in your life, then you can do things to the other that are at least acceptable or something that you don't have to pay attention to. Capitalism being the classic example of, you know, if you make poor people the other, then you can do whatever you want to them, you know, cut their benefits or whatever it might be. And I think that all contributes to decision making, even on a micro level of officer and citizen. And then that can create tensions, and that can separate folks as opposed to bringing them together, which I think is what we all need to do.
Yeah, really interesting. So we try and get away from the other and start seeing the same in each one of us. And it really is a great joy for me to have the honor of hosting these kinds of things. Thank you so much for this discussion. We're going to let people go. We took an extra 15 minutes this evening, but because these breakout sessions are so important, and it's a fascinating topic. And this is how we start to see more of the same with one another, rather than seeing people as different. So thank you. We hope that you continue the discussion, whether you're a panelist or participant in our Zoom room, whether you're watching on Facebook, whether you're watching after the fact on our website. We hope you continue to look through the links that we posted on Facebook and continue the discussion in your personal circles. This should be a stepping off point so we can continue the discussion no matter where we are and hopefully get to the point where we're doing more healing and solution generating. So just a couple of tidbits. If you want to learn more about our campaign, of course, you can follow us at votebenpogue.com. You can follow us on Twitter at votebenpogue, and you're already probably on our Facebook site. I want to thank once again our panelists for this evening, Dr. Jen Baker, Sam Bellamy, and Dayle Carlson. Really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much to our panelists who are willing to be here, be visible, and engage in those really difficult, sometimes uncomfortable conversations that make all the difference in the world. Our next Restorative Justice Forum is in 2 weeks, Healing the Harm of Domestic Violence. Mackie Crawcheck Moore will be there from Thrive, as well as other guests. We hope to see all of you there, and we'll catch up with you in a couple of weeks. Everybody, please stay healthy and stay safe and have a great evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hey guys, thanks.